Can I go pee before we start? You should have thought of that before you walked into my classroom. I'm watching you, Timmy. Ladies and gentlemen of the classroom, today we have a new lecture. This one is probably going to be a little bit shorter. Today's topic is what cards forget. And I know what you guys are thinking. What the hell? What do you mean? Cards don't have memory? Sir, they're made of cardboard. How? How are they forgoing? This is an interesting topic, and the reason why it's so interesting is because it is just a whole lot of memorizing. When it comes to what cards forget, you just have to like memorize it. It's really, there is no easier way than that. So the problem with that is that you can't like intuit how most of this works. You have to just know, and then when you know, you'll know. You know? We know basically what cards remember and what cards forget because of a ton of rulings either on the OCG database or from Konami emails. There is no be-all end-all article that Konami wrote or anything like that. Not like a PSCT like we know because Konami have written articles about PSCT and how PSCT works. This, to my knowledge, doesn't have any sort of articles or anything like that that tell you what a card remembers or not. All we have is precedent set by previous rulings. You kind of just roll with it. You go with the rulings that we have, and with those, you can establish precedent to know the information that a card remembers or forgets. I went through a ton of documents. Shoutouts to Pasm and Lantern for the documents that they wrote that were super helpful in doing the research for this video. That was super helpful for me. And yeah, let's get into it. Let's just do it. Let's get into it. So, who am I? Simple. I am Professor Distant Coder. You can call me Professor Coder. My favorite Yu-Gi-Oh game is Wheelie Breaker on the Nintendo Wii. Fantastic game. It's actually really bad. It's a horrible game. My glasses are, in fact, very fake. There are no lenses. They're just fake glasses for the drip, for swag. I don't have a PhD. A lot of people have been saying in the comments section, oh, he's Professor Crowler. He's got a PhD in Yu-Gi-Oh. You see, I do not have a PhD. I dropped out of college and then became a streamer. Congrats to me. I love dogs. Dogs are fantastic, and I'm a massive ruling nerd. That is the reason why I know all of this stuff and why I studied all of this stuff, because I very much did study. It really is just like, I just had this passion, kind of. I want to learn this stuff. Therefore, I will do anything I can to learn this stuff. And learn this stuff I did. And that is why I am very much prepared to teach you this lesson. Welcome to Chapter 1. Do you remember the 21st card you activated in September? Ladies and gentlemen, why do cards forget? How do cards forget? These are some really important questions to be asking here. I'm talking about very specifically two instances of ways that cards can forget certain things. The things that are involved with cards forgetting is the information that a card retains or loses when flipped face down via an effect such as Book of Eclipse, or if banished temporarily via an effect such as Farfa, Male Branch of the Burning Abyss. We're basically going to be talking about these two cards almost the entire time. So we're going to have to keep this in mind. And for those of you that are uninitiated, what Book of Eclipse does, you activate it, change all face-up monsters on the field to face down defense. And then in the end phase, you flip back up your opponent's monsters that are face down, and then they draw cards, but the draw cards doesn't really matter. And then with Farfa, is if it hits the grave, targets a monster on the field, and it banishes it until the end phase. Now, something that's important to keep in mind here is that temporary banishment is different than banishing something and then summoning that monster back. Basically, what I'm saying is Farfa is not the same thing as Zealantis. Zealantis, a card that typically a lot of people will use to reset effects. Zealantis is a card that will banish all monsters on the field and then special summon them back immediately to their owner's field. Farfa does not do that. Farfa banishes until the end phase. So Farfa returning the monster is not a special summon. It is temporary banishment. So that card is always still treated as the same card and either remembers or forgets certain things. So why do cards forget certain things but not others? What is the point of this lecture? Why is it that the cards don't just forget everything or forget nothing, or remember everything or remember nothing? Well, the real answer is because Konami said so. It's just the way Konami has designed their game, and Konami said, yep, these things work this way and these other things work that way, and deal with it. Like I said, there's no straight up article about how these things interact. And because there is none, we just basically have to use precedent from rulings that we have access to, either from OCG database, emails, or just precedent set by head judges. It all makes sense. Fantastic. You'll love to see it. Now that we've gotten the intro out of the way, we're going to get into chapter 2. What is remembered about summons? Just to clarify one thing before we start, you're going to see a lot of red X's and green check marks. We're going to establish ahead of time the precedent that if you see a red X over something, the information is forgotten. X means thing forgore, it forgets. Whereas green check mark means thing is remembered. Okay? So keep that in mind because this is kind of all over the lecture. So the first chapter that we're going to go into here, chapter 2, this chapter outlines everything that a card will remember or forget in relation to its own summon, when it is banished temporarily or flipped face down. So, information regarding summons. The properties of cards used to perform a monster summon, will they be remembered or forgotten? And when I'm talking about the properties of cards used, I'm talking about the number of cards used to perform a summon, such as like the number of materials used for a link, and the name, level, attribute, type, etc. of the cards used to perform the summon. So right now the topic is what is remembered by a monster that used other monsters as material, if that monster is flip face down or banished temporarily. So if it's flip face down by Book of Eclipse, it will forget. The monster will forget all of the properties associated to the cards that it used as a link material. I'll get into examples afterwards. And when banished temporarily, the same thing. So if you book or you banish temporarily a monster that used other monsters as material, the properties of the monsters that it used as material are forgotten. Examples of this. Naturia Bamboo Shoot says if this card is tribute summoned by tributing a Naturia monster, while this card remains face up on the field, your opponent cannot activate spell or trap cards. If you were to book it, or you were to banish it, Bamboo Shoot, when it returns via the effect of Farfa or after it gets flipped back up again, does not remember that it tributed a Naturia monster. So it forgets the properties, the name of the card that it tributed for its tribute summon. Another example is Saryuja Skulldread. This one can't be flipped face down, but if you were to banish Saryuja temporarily, Saryuja, a monster that gains effects based on the number of materials that you use to summon this thing, will be forgotten. So if you were to Farfa a Saryuja, and then it returns to the field, even if that Saryuja, let's say, was summoned using 3 different monsters, and normally would have the effect to special summon a monster from hand, if you banish it temporarily and it comes back, then Saryuja would not be able to summon a monster from the hand. It forgets. And then Red Eyes Dark Dragoon. Let's assume that Dragoon can be targeted, okay, for the purposes of this. I know it can't be targeted. You can't Farfa Dragoon. For the purpose of this, let's assume that a Dragoon can be targeted, okay? If you were to flip it face down, or you were to banish it temporarily, it would forget the properties of the monster used to summon it. And what's important about that, you got to keep in mind with Dragoon, it gets to destroy a monster, or monsters on your opponent's side of the field, equal to the number of normal monsters that were used to summon it. So it will forget the properties of the card used to summon it, therefore it forgets how many normal monsters were used to summon it, and it will not be able to pop anything. Next up, also regarding summons, the specific copies of cards that are used to perform a monster summon. Now this is different to the properties of the cards used to summon it. We're talking about what the specific materials were, which physical card was used as material for these cards. And if your monster is flipped face down, it remembers that information. And if it's banished temporarily, it also remembers that information, which seems extremely counterintuitive. This sounds incredibly silly. Why is it that the card forgets everything written on the cards for the materials, but the physical materials themselves are remembered? Now let's give some examples of this. For example, Ascension Sky Dragon, which has the effect that says when this card you control is destroyed by your opponent's card and sent to the grave, if all the monsters that were used for the synchro summon of this card are in your grave, you can special summon all of them. So if your Ascension Sky Dragon is flipped face down or banished temporarily, comes back, gets flipped back up or anything like that, and then gets destroyed, it still remembers what its synchro materials were. so it will still be able to bring those synchro materials back. Another example of this, once again, let's assume Red Eyes Dark Dragoon can be targeted. We've established previously, let's say you used Red Eyes Black Dragon and Dark Magician to summon Red Eyes Dark Dragoon. It gets flipped face down or it gets banished. After you flip it back up or after it comes back, it can't destroy anything because it forgets that the monsters that it used for its fusion summon were normal monsters. However, if you were to defusion on your Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, again, we're assuming that it can be targeted. If you were to defusion, which says target fusion monster on the field, return that target to the extra deck, then if all the materials that were used for its fusion summon in your grave, you can summon all of them, defusion will successfully summon the Dark Magician and the Red Eyes Black Dragon, despite the fact that Red Eyes Dark Dragoon forgot how many normal monsters were used to make its, to basically fusion summon it. That makes no sense. That is true. I agree. This makes absolutely no sense. And this is why this is a topic that is so difficult for a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh players to remember, because a lot of this really is just a memory game. Exactly when it comes to what cards remember or forget, it's all set on a bunch of different precedents, and it feels like the precedents were all made by a bunch of different people. I don't know exactly. So yeah, it's really goofy. It's just one of those things where the properties of the card summoned are forgotten. However, which physical piece of cardboard was used to summon is remembered. Next up, information regarding the summons when pertaining to the specific, I can't fucking, editor, cut that out, please, thank you. The specific effect used to perform a monster summon. Here we're talking if a monster was summoned this way or something like that. If the monster is flipped face down, it will forget. If the monster is banished temporarily, it will also forget. When we're talking about something like Destiny Hero Dogma, which says that it must be special summoned from your hand by attributing 3 monsters, including at least a Destiny Hero, and if you still control this face-up card during your opponent's next standby phase, after you special summoned it this way, half your opponent's life points. And this is an interesting one because this one was kind of up for debate for a while. So if flip face down or banished temporarily, does the Dogma remember that it was special summoned this way? And the answer is no. It does not remember that it was special summoned this way, meaning that if you book it or banish it temporarily, even though it's going to be face up on your opponent's board during your standby phase and would half your life points, it doesn't remember that it was special summoned this way, so that effect will not be able to be activated. And what's interesting about this one is that there was actually an OCG database entry that said that the Dogma would be able to activate and was later deleted. It was retracted. So I guess even Konami aren't 100% certain how they want these cards to work. Them deleting it is probably precedent enough to set that in this situation, being flipped face down or banished temporarily, it don't remember. Same thing with the Ascendant of Thunder, card that special summons itself from hand by paying 3,000 and says if this card summoned this way in its owner's control is destroyed by an opponent's card by battle or card effect, gain 5,000. If flip face down or banished temporarily, it will forget that it was summoned this way, and therefore, if you banish it temporarily or flip it face down before popping it, they will not gain back 5,000 life points. They simply won't. Next up, this one's an important one. The location where a monster was summoned from. We're talking if a monster says summon from the hand, summon from the extra deck, summon from the graveyard. The location a monster was summoned from, if flipped face down, is forgotten. However, if banished temporarily, is remembered. Note that down. Put that in your notepad. I think the best example of this is going to be Shaddoll Fusion. So let's say I have a Dante Traveler of the Burning Abyss that was summoned from my extra deck, gets flip face down by Book of Eclipse. If my opponent were to activate Shaddoll Fusion, which if I control a monster summoned from the extra deck, can send monsters from the deck to the grave to fusion summon. If I have a flipped face down Dante, it doesn't remember that it was summoned from the extra deck, therefore Shaddoll Fusion cannot send from the deck in order to fusion summon. As opposed to the opposite scenario where I have a Dante that was Farfa'd. It got banished temporarily and it comes back. If my opponent activates Shaddoll Fusion, I control a Dante Traveler of the Burning Abyss that was banished temporarily and came back. It remembers that it was summoned from the extra deck, therefore Shaddoll Fusion can send materials from the deck to the graveyard in order to perform the fusion summon. That's because it's considering that it could be flip summoned, while temporarily banished wouldn't allow it to be summoned any other way. That is incorrect. So let's talk about this topic super fast. All right. Little slight tangent. If a monster is special summoned, let's say I special summon Cyber Dragon. You Book of Moon my Cyber Dragon, and then I flip summon that Cyber Dragon on a later turn. My Cyber Dragon is not only considered flip summoned, it is also considered special summoned. It can be both. It was a special summon monster that got flipped face down and then got flip summoned. Keep that in mind, that you flip summoning a monster does not erase the previous way that it was summoned. In some instances. All right, there are exceptions to this. When it comes specifically to the location where a monster was summoned from, it is forgotten if the monster is flipped face down. It is remembered if the monster is banished temporarily. How can there be exceptions? Oh, there's always exceptions. Next up, whether a monster was normal, tribute, or special summoned or set. This is exactly what we were just talking about just now. We're talking about the type of special summons as well. If a monster was ritual summoned, fusion summoned, synchro summoned, XC summoned, link summoned, normal summoned, tribute summoned, flip summoned, all this stuff. A lot of people seem to have this like weird belief that if a monster was special summoned, flipped face down, then flip summoned, it's only flip summoned. If I XC summon a monster, is it so crazy that my monster is both an XC summoned monster and a special summoned monster? Is that so crazy? I don't think that's crazy at all. So in that regard, why would it be so crazy that my monster that was initially special summoned, then flip face down, then flip summoned, why can't it be both? If you Book of Eclipse, if you flip face down a monster that was, let's say, ritual, fusion, synchro, XC summoned, link summoned, well, not link summoned, obviously, but ritual to XC summon, will it remember that it was ritual, fusion, synchro, XC summon, normal summon, special summon? Yes, it does. And the same is applied when it comes to banishment temporarily. If you temporarily banish a monster, or if you flip it face down, it will remember the method with which it was summoned. Now, the thing that's interesting is that with the previous example, with the Shoutouts fusion, you can control a Dante that remembers that it was Xyz summoned, but it does not remember that it was Xyz summoned from the extra deck if you flipped it face down. Is that not hilarious? I think that's so goofy that you can control a monster that remembers I was fusion summoned. From where? I don't freaking know. What? What kind of question? I don't know. That, I think, is absolutely psychotic. However, that's neither here nor there. That is just how the game works. I don't make the rules. I just talk about them. We'll go over it, and then we'll go over the 3 exceptions, because there's 3 of them things, okay? So get your little notepads ready, chat, because we got some exceptions. Let's do it. All right, so examples of this, like, normal interaction, right? Aria the Melodious Diva, while this special summon card is on the field, melodious monsters you control cannot be targeted by card effects or destroyed by battle. If you flip this face down or you banish it temporarily, after it returns or after it gets flipped back up, it still remembers that it was special summoned. Therefore, and this is even if you flip summon it, it can be a special summoned / flip summoned monster. So it will remember. Same thing with Fluanderies and Empen. Empen specifically says, while this tribute summoned card is in the monster zone, your opponent can't activate the effects of special summoned monsters that are in attack. If you book an Empen or banish an Empen temporarily, after it returns or after it gets flipped back up, it still remembers that it was a tribute summoned monster. Therefore, that effect to floodgate your opponent's special summoned monsters in attack is still applied, because 2 can play at this game. Let's get into the exceptions, ladies and gentlemen. Exception number 1. We're talking about Aroma Jar. Remembering whether or not a card was flip summoned. If you flip a monster back down, it forgets that it was flip summoned, okay? That is one of the few methods that a card will forget. It forgets that it is a flip summon card if flipped back down. It also, if banished, will forget that it was a flip summoned monster. So if a card says, like, if this flip summoned monster is face up on the field, whatever, such as Aroma Jar, which says during each player's end phase, if this card is face up on the field, gain 500, that was a flip effect. While this flip face up card is on the field, it cannot be destroyed by battle. It forgets that it was a flipped face up card on the field, which is super counterintuitive, even when it's flipped back up. Well, if you flip it back up, then that will reapply. But if you banish it temporarily and then it comes back, then it will forget. Or if you flip it face down, then it'll forget until you flip it back up again. Exception number 2. Now we're going to be talking about some cards that I know y'all have not seen or read, and most of you might not even know how they work. We're talking about Geminis, okay? Illblood, a Gemini monster. For those of you unfamiliar with the Gemini mechanic, Gemini monsters are monsters that do not have an effect until you normal summon them again. That's the way that they work. So if you control a Gemini monster that you did not re-normal summon, it's just a vanilla. And then you must, on a later turn, give up your normal summon to re-normal summon it again in order for it to gain its effect. Very, very convoluted type of card. They don't really make these anymore. So Gemini monsters, if flipped face down after being Gemini summoned, forget that they were Gemini summoned. Meaning that if I normal summon an Illblood or special summon an Illblood or whatever, and then give up my normal summon to normal summon it again, and then it gets flipped face down, after it gets flipped back up, it will be treated as a normal monster and will not have its Gemini summoned effect. And the same is true when banished. Same thing. If you have a Gemini monster that was Gemini summoned, then Gemini summon is not an actual term, I should say, but we'll just call it Gemini summon to make sense of all this. So if you have a Gemini monster that was Gemini summoned and it gets banished temporarily by Farfa or by anything else that does the same kind of thing, after it returns, the Gemini monster will be a normal monster and you will have to normal summon it again, Gemini summon it again, if you will, in order to get its effect back again. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. You're like, Coder, I get it. Okay, it's fine. Like, the type of summons are remembered, but Flip and Gemini aren't. Seems simple enough. Surely there's no weird exception to the rule that doesn't make any sense, right? Surely there's no third super messed up, possibly even goofy, silly exception? Well, you see, there is a third exception. And that exception is for everyone's favorite type of monster. Y'all like pendulums? In the case of a monster that was pendulum summoned, if the monster is flipped face down, it will forget that it was pendulum summoned. However, if your pendulum summoned monster is banished temporarily, after it comes back, it will remember that it was in fact pendulum summoned. So there's an exception to the rule that's only half an exception, sort of. And that's relevant for something like Odd Eyes Phantom Dragon, which says when this pendulum summoned card inflicts battle damage to your opponent by attacking, you can inflict damage to your opponent equal to the number of Odd Eyes cards in your pendulum zones times 1200. So let's say I pendulum summon my Odd Eyes Phantom Dragon, I flip it face down, or my opponent flips it face down, it gets flipped back up, it forgets that it was pendulum summoned, therefore that effect cannot be applied. As opposed to if I pendulum summon Odd Eyes Phantom Dragon, it gets banished temporarily and then returns via the effect of Farfa or something, and then it attacks into my opponent's monster, it will be able to apply that effect because it is still this pendulum summoned card. I know what you guys are thinking. You're like, God, I need to remember all of this. I must lock it all into my little brain. I know it doesn't make sense. I know that there is no rhyme or reason to any of this. It is what it is, and that's just how it works, and you just gotta know it. And I'm sorry. So the flip summon sort of overrides the pendulum summon? No. You guys need to stop doing that. If a monster's flip face down, even before you flip summon it, it's no longer a pendulum summon monster. Let's say I pendulum summon an Odd Eyes Phantom Dragon, and then my opponent Book of Moons it, and then I have some kind of effect that says target a pendulum summoned monster you control. My Odd Eyes Phantom Dragon wouldn't be a legal target for that because it is not a pendulum summoned monster I control anymore. The moment it gets flipped face down, it is no longer pendulum summoned. Keep in mind, all of this like information retaining or whatever, if a card forgets it when flipped face down, it forgets it immediately when flipped face down, not specifically after you flip it back up. From seeing Farfa in all lectures, I think Farfa is the problem with Yu-Gi-Oh! I would agree. Yeah, we should collectively ban Farfa, I think. So those are the 3 exceptions. And then still on the topic of summons, we also have the specific turn in which a monster was summoned or set. If the monster is flipped face down, it still remembers if it was summoned this turn, or if a monster is banished temporarily, it also still remembers if it was summoned this turn. Now you might be wondering why that matters. In what situations would that matter? Curry Bandit says during the end phase, if this card was normal summoned this turn, you contribute this card, excavate the top 5, and all that stuff. If you Book of Eclipse a Curry Bandit, During the end phase, Book of Eclipse will flip Curry Bandit back up if your opponent's the one using Book of Eclipse on your Curry Bandit. And in that same end phase, after it gets flipped back up by Book of Eclipse, your Curry Bandit is allowed to activate because it remembers that it was summoned this turn. Another example of this is if it gets banished temporarily, Farfa will return the Curry Bandit to the field during the end phase of this turn. In that situation, the Curry Bandit will also still remember that it was summoned this turn, and after being returned to the field by the Farfa effect, it will be able to activate because it was summoned this turn. I know this seems like kind of convoluted, but a card will remember whether or not it was summoned this turn or what specific turn it was summoned on, despite the fact that it was flip face down or banished temporarily. And ladies and gentlemen, that is it for information that is retained or lost pertaining to summons. So now we're talking about what is remembered about effects. We're talking about effects that are applied to a card, and then that card is flipped face down or banished temporarily. We will talk about whether or not the card remembers or forgets which effects were applied to it. Regarding effects, if an effect was previously applied to a monster, note that the information regarding an effect that was previously applied to a face down monster is not forgotten when that face down monster is flipped face up. This is saying that you previously resolved an effect on a monster. Does that monster remember what effect was applied to it if flipped face down or if banished temporarily? Just keep in mind, this is when flipped face down, not when flipped face up. If you apply an effect to a face down monster and you flip that monster face up later, that effect will still be applied to that monster. So if a monster is flipped face down, it will forget any effects that were applied to it. If it is banished temporarily, it will also forget any effects that were applied to it. For example, a Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon, or you could say the same kind of situation with an IP or something like that. A Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon that was synchro summoned using Wind Witch Snowbell, which says that if you synchro summon a monster using it, that synchro monster can't be destroyed by card effects. It's basically synchro IP Masquerena. If you flip the Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon face down or you banish it temporarily, after it comes back or after being flipped face down, it will forget that it cannot be destroyed by card effects. Same thing if you were to SP banish a monster that was link summoned using IP, then that monster would forget that it has the IP Masquerena protection. Another example is, let's say I summon a sea monster of Theseus with Instant Fusion. Instant Fusion, which says, special summon a monster, but destroy it during the end phase. If you were to flip it face down or banish it temporarily, when the end phase comes around, the sea monster of Theseus will forget the effect that was applied to it that says that it would be destroyed in the end phase, and therefore is not destroyed by Instant Fusion. It will forget that kind of effect. If you apply an effect to a face-up monster and it gets flipped face down or banished temporarily, it will forget what effect was applied to it. Moving on with effects. If the non-named once per turn restriction of a monster's effect has been used this turn. I'm going to put this in layman's terms. If the soft once per turn was used, okay? We have a difference between a soft once per turn and a hard once per turn, a named once per turn and a non-named once per turn. The difference here would be if a card says once per turn, do this, but it's a once per turn per individual copy of the card versus you can only use this effect of named card once per turn. The example that we're talking about here is cards that specifically say once per turn, you can do this or something like that, which we as players refer to as a soft once per turn. So basically, if a monster is flipped face down or banished temporarily, does it remember that it used its soft once per turn effect? Let's talk about it. If flipped face down, does it forget that it used its soft once per turn? Yes, it will forget that it used its soft once per turn, implying that if flipped back up, you could use it again. And if banished temporarily, will it forget that it used its soft once per turn? Once again, yes, it will forget that it used its soft once per turn, implying that if you were to banish it temporarily and bring it back, you would be able to use it again. With an exception. There is an exception. One very specific exception, and we'll talk about it. So examples of this. Homunculus, the alchemic being, says once per turn you can change the attribute of this card. I just grabbed the most basic, simple, soft once per turn I could find. Once per turn you can change the attribute of this card. If you were to book it and then flip it back up with something like Book of Tayu, you could use the effect again. So let's say you go Homunculus, declare fire. It becomes a fire. And then you book it, Book of Tayu it back up in that same main phase. You can use Homunculus again in order to declare dark. And then you would change the attribute again. But if it was banished, in this example, I'm going to use Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon. because I need the monster to be back on the field of the main phase. So for context, what Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon does, and we're going to talk about Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon a little bit more moving forward. Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon says that if it battles an opponent's monster, you can banish that opponent's monster and itself until the end of that battle phase. Meaning that it basically just view Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon as a means of temporarily banishing a card and bringing it back to the field and still having a main phase afterwards to do stuff with the card. So in this situation, if I go Homunculus, Call Fire, and then battle my opponent's Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon, and their Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon temporarily banishes my Homunculus and brings it back. And then we go to the main phase 2. Because it was banished temporarily, the Homunculus will forget that it used its effect. It's soft once per turn effect, so it will be able to use its soft once per turn effect again. So Homunculus has forgotten that its once per turn effect has already been used. Therefore, it can be used again this turn after being flipped face up or banished temporarily. Now for the exception. And this is one that actually mattered in very specific decks, but in recent years. And this is the exception with monsters that have a once per turn effect to flip themselves face down. Here I used Stealth Bird because it's just a very basic, simple card, but the same still applies to the big sub-terror monsters that have the effect to flip themselves face down. Let's say you start your turn and I have a face-up Stealth Bird, and I go Stealth Bird effect to flip itself face down. And then I flip summon it to apply the effect to burn my opponent for 1,000. The exception to this rule is that specifically when it pertains to soft once per turn effects to book themselves, that information is retained. Meaning that if monsters have an effect to specifically flip themselves face down, they're not forgotten, therefore cannot be used again. You cannot legally start your turn with a face-up Stealth Bird or a face-up Umastrix if you're playing Sub-Terror, and go effect to flip itself face down, flip face down, flip summon it to apply its flip effect, and then go apply the effect to flip itself face down again. Specifically when it pertains to effects to flip themselves face down. And we can take this one step further. Let's say you're in this exact same instance, and you have a face-up Stealth Bird at the start of your turn. You go Stealth Bird effect to flip itself face down, flip summon it, apply the effect to burn it for 1,000. Then you Book of Moon your Stealth Bird. Then you Book of Tayu your Stealth Bird, back face up. Can you then use the effect of Stealth Bird to flip itself face down? And the answer to that is, again, still, no, you cannot. So when it comes to a card that has an effect to specifically flip itself face down, and only itself, even though it's a soft once per turn, that soft once per turn will not reset if it is flipped face down, even by another effect, or just its own, or anything like that. Moving on. That was everything pertaining to effects. And now we're going to move on to the last section, which is a very short one. This is a very short section. But we're talking about battle position changes and attacks, which is an important one, kind of. This one doesn't come up as often, but it can still come up. So let's talk about it. Information regarding battle position if a monster's battle position was manually changed this turn. I'm talking about if you have put your hand on the card and went, I will change my BLS to attack. So if your monster manually changed its battle position this turn and then gets flipped face down by a Book of Eclipse or by a Book of Moon, can you manually change the battle position again? The answer is no. It remembers that it manually changed its battle position. I get that this is a little bit confusing. So you can't change its battle position again. The reason why is because the information is retained. It remembers that it already manually changed its battle position this turn. And if the monster is banished temporarily, we're going to use Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon. The reason why we're using Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon is because if we use Farfa, the monster comes back in the end phase, at which point you cannot manually change the battle position. But if you Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon, the information is forgotten, which is interesting enough. An example of this is Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon itself. So let's say I have a Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon on my field, in defense, let's say, and I turn it to attack, and then my opponent uses Book. Will my Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon remember that it was manually had its battle position changed this turn? Yes, therefore I cannot then flip summon it, because I've already changed the battle position this turn. As opposed to, if I have my Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon, it's in defense, I change it to attack. I enter battle phase, and I attack my opponent's monster, and then I use the effect of Galaxy Eyes Photon Dragon to banish their monster and my Galaxy-Sized Photon Dragon until the end of the battle phase. End of the battle phase, my Galaxy-Sized Photon Dragon comes back in attack. Does it remember that it manually changes battle position? The answer is no. Therefore, you can once again change its battle position, which is super interesting. I have my defense Galaxy-Sized Photon Dragon. I can turn it to attack my opponent's guy, banish both temporarily. End of battle phase, they come back. Main phase 2, change my Galaxy-Sized Photon Dragon to defense. And then the other example, information regarding attacks. If a monster has declared an attack this turn. So how does the monster remember that it declared an attack this turn? If flip face down, it does remember that it declared an attack this turn. That's the reason why if you declare an attack with a monster and then your opponent goes Book of Moon, you can't then flip summon your monster even though you didn't manually change its battle position, because as we know, a monster that declared a battle this turn cannot change its battle position. But with temporary banishment, the monster will forget that it declared an attack this turn. So let's give you an example for this one, and this is a pretty good one. Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning, has an effect that says once per turn you can activate one of these effects. Target a monster on the field, banish it. This card cannot attack the turn this effect is activated. And if this attacking card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, it can make a second attack in a row. So let's say, for example, my BLS declares an attack. And then it gets flipped face down. And then main phase 2, I flip it back up with Book of Taiyu. BLS will remember that it declared an attack. Therefore, it cannot banish a monster with its effect, because it remembers that it did declare an attack. As opposed to, if I control a BLS, I go battle phase and I attack my opponent's Galaxy-Sized Photon Dragon, and then the Galaxy-Sized Photon Dragon temporarily banishes both, and then end of the battle phase brings them both back. My BLS will forget that it declared an attack, therefore can activate its effect to banish a card. Gotta love to see it. So chat, let me quiz y'all on a thing. We got a BLS, ladies and gentlemen. We got a BLS. Let's say I control a vanilla, like some monster, like an Avram, a Mech Knight Avram or something, and I control a Galaxy-Sized Photon Dragon. If my opponent controls BLS and goes battle phase, BLS, attack my Avram, destroys it in battle, BLS activates its effect in order to make a second attack in a row. And then the BLS attacks my Galaxy-Sized Photon Dragon. And I go Galaxy-Sized Photon Dragon effect to banish the BLS and the Galaxy-Sized Photon Dragon until the end of the battle phase. And then end of battle phase, they both come back. In main phase 2, can my opponent activate the first effect of BLS that says target a monster on the field, banish that target face up? It is a soft once, so it can use the other effect. Good job, chat. Good job. Fantastic job, chat. Yes, because it is a soft once per turn, as we know, if a monster is banished temporarily, it will forget that it activated its soft once per turn effect. So because it's a soft once per turn, that will be reset by the Galaxy-Sized Photon Dragon. And then it will also, as we've stated just before this, because a monster was banished temporarily, it forgets that it attacked this turn. Therefore, none of the restrictions that make it that the BLS wouldn't be able to banish are being applied, so the BLS is able to banish a card in this scenario. Can we get our judge license now? No. Now, chat, I know what you guys are thinking. You're like, Coder, there's way too much to remember. There's way too much. I cannot remember all of this. You guys can thank Pazm, okay? Pazm is a very active judge in the community, and Pazm made a graph, like a table that has all this information. So I'm just gonna put it right here. There it is, ladies and gentlemen. Screenshot that if you guys so desire. There it is, the chart that has all of the information that tells you whether or not information about a card is remembered or forgotten. Huge shout outs to Pazm the GOAT for this one. I won't take any credit for this. I didn't make this at all. I did use a lot of this for the information pertaining to the lecture that I made today. So thank you to Pazm for that. And I also borrow a lot of information from documents written by Lantern, a good buddy of mine who since hasn't done so much, but he was a long time judge in the community and stuff like that. Yeah, if you guys want to just screenshot this or whatever, this graph just has everything here that you need to know. Do we have one more topic, Coder? Here's an apple. Thank you. No, that's it for today's lecture. Make sure you guys subscribe over at youtube.com/distantcoder or twitch.tv/distant not or, and do both. Subscribe to both, follow on both platforms, and join my Discord, Discord, discord.gg/distantcoder. You guys can pull up, ask away your ruling questions. We have a ruling chat in there. With that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate you all. I put a lot of effort into this one, and I think it's going to be a useful one. If you guys learned something, I'm happy. That's the goal at the end of the day. Thank you guys, everyone. Class dismissed, chat. Have a good one. Have a fun recess.